I am Subbarao Kambhampati from Arizona State University. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you all regarding AI and the interactions between AI systems and humans today. I understand you're all over the world, including, of course, in Samsung headquarters, and I'm really looking forward to share my thoughts on this today. So today I want to talk to you about how AI systems can interact with humans fluently, help them, collaborate with them, team with them, and be comprehensible to them. So my talk, of course, is titled Synthesizing Interpretable Behavior for Human-Aware AI Systems. Let me get started. So AI is, of course, all over the place right now. We hear so many things about, positive as well as negative hype, comparing AI to electricity, comparing it to fire and electricity, AI being compared to God on one side. So there are all this, high positive hype. There's also a bunch of worries that people have about AI potentially being a big threat to the civilization and what sort of societal impacts it might have and so on. Among all the news items that you keep seeing about AI, the things that I actually like, the kind of advertisements that I like are these sorts of ones where, AI is helping an old lady cross the street, AI is playing with kids, basically hanging around with humans without making a huge fuss. So I want AI systems to be able to work with humans in a fluent and transparent way. Now, if you're wondering how come this particular breaking news was not seen by you, that's because it's fake news. I just made it up myself. But the question that I had to myself is, why is it that the AI as a field hasn't worked as much in the beginnings at any rate on getting AI systems to work with humans in a transparent and a fluent way? It's almost AI has a curious ambivalence to the humans. It looks as if our systems are happiest either far away from humans are in very adversarial stance with humans, essentially creaming us in every possible board game at any rate right now. So it's almost like, as John Lennon once said, we seem to want to help humanity. Somehow it's the people that we AI folks don't seem to be able to stand, which is kind of disappointing. So in fact, some time back when I gave an presidential address at Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, I basically chose as my topic the challenges of human-aware AI systems. And I was looking specifically at how come we are not taking it more seriously and what are the challenges in it? Is it really worth the endeavor for AI systems to be interested in AI researchers to make the interaction between AI and humans be more fluent, and what are the technical challenges and what are some of the long-term issues? I was talking about this, and one of the things I try to get across, and I try to get across to you here too, is that in fact, AI systems working with humans makes it sort of expands the reach and scope of the overall AI enterprise. After all, there is this evolutionary theory which says that we did not develop these huge brains we have to run away from the tigers of the savannah or the lions of Bengal, but really to work with each other, strategize with each other, and essentially be able to have this social intelligence is one of the reasons why we apparently developed this kind of a large brain. And so I'm interested in talking about human-aware AI systems. And of course, human-aware AI systems are needed all over the place. There are, of course, areas where AI systems have to interact with humans pretty much from the get-go. Intelligent tutoring systems, for example, social robotics, these are areas that actually, to some extent, looked at how to deal with some of these issues of making AI systems work with humans. But then I want to get you to understand that those are not the only areas. In fact, anytime AI systems are in our midst, actually in the midst of humans, they essentially need to be aware of humans. So that requires assistance, human-aware digital personal assistants. Imagine how nice it would be if my Bixby on my Samsung Watch, for example, was able to keep track of what it is that I'm trying to achieve and then provide its answers in a much more context-specific way. Human-aware office and hospital assistants, and then, of course, teaming, elbow-to-elbow teaming between humans and robots on factory floors, remote and cognitive teaming, such as in search and rescue with commanders somewhere in a safe place and the robots in the rubble, for example, and even things like self-explaining factory robots. So, in fact, I tend to think that increasingly, if AI is everywhere, then human-computer interaction really will be human-AI interaction. And so we need to understand in what ways human-AI interaction can be made more effective and what are the challenges involved in that. And so my question is, what does it take for an AI agent to show interpretable behavior in the presence of human agents? And the simple answer, and then of course I'll take longer time to elaborate it, and you probably understand this too, that the simple answer in trying to, the way we try to get along with each other is managing mental models. And that's what AI systems have to do. For example, starting from as far back as Salian test, we know that social intelligence involves, for example, realizing the agent realizing that the human has potentially different beliefs than it has, and using that knowledge to actually take that knowledge into account in synthesizing its behavior. This is something that we will talk about in concrete terms. So the overview of my talk essentially is just trying to get across the following points. I want to get across that effective human-AI interactions requires AI systems to be able to manage mental models they have of humans. And these involve essentially first as well as second-order mental models. So humans' models of their own tasks, as well as humans' model of the robot and its tasks, or the AI system and its tasks. And then I want to tell you how managing mental models brings up both inference and learning challenges, and I'll talk about some of those challenges. In particular, we'll talk about how to get explicable behavior, how to generate explanations, and how to handle these things when there are vocabulary differences. And finally, frameworks for human-AI interaction have to be evaluated with actual human subject studies, because it's not very reasonable for a bunch of AI engineers to assume that since they are humans, they know what would be acceptable to other humans. And so there are actual fields that look at human factors and human interaction, and we need to actually do these studies, careful studies. And then I'll end with a little discussion about the fact that once your systems are able to mental model the human in the loop, that allows them the ability to manipulate the humans in the loop. And so, in fact, we are always worried about head fakes, but deep fakes, but really head fakes are the worst form of deep fakes, that the most powerful forms of deep fakes. And we really want to think about how those sort of ethical challenges can be handled. So that's the overview of my talk, and I'll try to get you through some of these points. So let's get back to like a robot or an AI system, essentially trying to figure out how to achieve some goals that it has set for itself or what's given to it. And if it's a single agent, in a simple scenario, let's say there may be, it has its own model MR, which is the robot's model, and then it uses that to come up with a behavior, a sequence of actions that will take it to its desired goals. There could be more general ideas such as, policies, but, for our discussions, this is a good place to start from. Now, the moment you put a human in the loop, now it turns out that the human has their own model of the task, and the robot then has to have a sense of that model of the task. That's how it figures out the human's intentions, goals, and use that to provide assistance to them, at least avoid getting into their way, and sometimes try to team, etc. This part, which is essentially, this is one mental model, which is getting the model of humans' beliefs, desires, and intentions, and as well as their actions, task actions. That's the first type. In some sense, that kind of has gone under the description of intention recognition, for example. And so there are multiple ways an AI system can recognize the intentions of the humans in the loop, unobtrusively, hopefully, or sometimes with some help. In this particular case, actually, in the examples that, from our lab, we're using emotive BCI interfaces, brain-computer interfaces, not the type of neural link ones, but the simpler ones to essentially guess what people are trying to achieve. In this particular case, for the robot, is trying to use that information. And in fact, the similar kinds of things can be done similar kinds of technologies can be used. For example, a HoloLens technology can be used in addition to simple, voice and pictures by computers, by AI systems to project their own intentions. Again, another study from our lab. Okay, now that is the first order, but the second order is actually more interesting from the point of view of my talk today. So the robot essentially has a model, obviously, and the humans always try to model anything that they're interacting with. So if they're interacting with an AI system, they're going to have a model of that AI system. So in this particular case, the human has MRH, which is their own approximation of what they think the robot's tasks are, actions are, and goals are, and preferences are, and so on. And then the robot now has to approximate this too. So it has to estimate not just what the humans want to do, but also what humans expect the robot to be doing. This is what I'm calling M-hat-RH. And that actually, this second order model winds up being very helpful for the AI systems, the robots, embodied robots, or decision support systems, to either conform to the expectations humans have of them or to explain their behavior if, in fact, it winds up going away from the expectations that the humans have. And the explanations will essentially be changing MRH by dialogue. So that's what, in some sense, explanations are. I want to show you some use cases of this in the work that we have done, and the two kinds of use cases that we look at are search and reconnaissance scenario, for example. In this particular is a toy version of search and reconnaissance scenario, and then which is a embodied robot. On the other side, we also do human AI interaction in the context of decision support systems. So, for example, a human mission planner getting help in completing their plans, a course of actions with the help of the AI system in the loop. Okay, so it turns out that the challenges are similar in both cases. Okay, let's get to what winds up happening in terms of conforming to expectations versus providing explanations. I pointed out that the robot now has the second order model of what the human thinks its model is, so MRH. And the robot's actual model, MR, might well differ from MRH. In most cases, humans may not have completely correct idea of what the robot robots model is. So if they're exactly identical, it's a great world. In fact, the humans and robots will be able to work together quite fine. But most of the time, there would be differences. And in that case, as a consequence, the plans that are optimal for the robot may well be not seen as optimal according to the human's expectations of the robot. So that will lead to inexplicable behavior. So the humans are thinking, why is this robot doing this? You might not be surprised to hear that many, of the few robot factory accidents, many of them happen when unexpected behavior occurs because of, on the robot's part. And, many a time current robots are essentially fully controlled. And as we go forward, they'll become more autonomous. And so, in fact, the inexplicable behavior becomes a more important issue to control for. And in these cases, when there is this, robot realizes that MRH and MR are different, it has two options. One is conform to the expectations or change the MRH that the human has so that it's more closer to what the robot's actual model is. So the first one is what we call explicable planning, and the second one is providing explanations. And I want to show you some, demos of this to get a sense of this. So I'll be looking in this particular case at a, a search and rescue kind of a scenario where a human commander is in a safe place and the robot is looking in some building, looking for injured people. Now, in the beginning, the human and the robot share the map of the environment, but then as the robot goes in, it has essentially more knowledge. For example, certain paths might be closed, certain paths that the human thought were actually feasible may not be feasible, and sometimes the paths might open too. Okay, so in this particular case, it turns out that the shortest path to where the robot is supposed to go would have gone through this corridor, and it turns out there is an obstacle here. And the robot has two options here. One basically is to just essentially take time to remove the obstacle and go in the direction, in the path that the human expected it to go. And this is basically the robot showing explicable behavior. So you're conforming to the human's expectations. To do this computationally, essentially the robot has to take in its planning process not only the cost of the current plan with respect to its model, but also how far this plan is from what the human is expecting it to do and reduce that distance. So in some sense, it becomes a regularizer such that behaviors that are more in conformance with what humans expect the robot to do would be produced. Now, explicable planning is great. If you actually do what people expect you to do, you never have to open your mouth. But then your life can sometimes get quite hard because you're doing what people expect you to do rather than what is optimal for you. It's the same for people as well as for the robots. So conforming to expectations can be costly. So a second idea is the robot basically in this case saying, look, I'm not going to take that short path because that's closed. And so it's basically giving an explanation saying the path from P1 to P8 is not clear, and it's taking the second best path. So now the human basically not only is seeing that the robot is deviating from what they expected it, but they're getting this explanation. That explanation changes their model of the environment and model of the robot. With respect to that changed model, it turns out that the robot's behavior is indeed optimal. Okay, so here we are now talking about explanations as model reconciliation, and essentially the whole process of explanation is the robot trying to change the MRH of the humans with epsilon changes with respect to how the actions, the preconditions, the effects, and so on are different from what the human thinks they are, so that then human would also be able to see that the robot's behavior is indeed optimal with respect to this changed model. Okay, so it turns out that searching for these explanations involves a model space search, and in this search, you will be able to find a variety of different kinds of explanations, the minimal explanations, as well as explanations that will stay the test of time in terms of longer sets of interactions. I do want you to understand that conciseness of explanations is important, because the robot can always just dump its own whole model onto the human and say, read this stuff. From this, you should be able to figure out what I'm doing. And that's just too hard for the humans to comprehend. And so you want to always provide explanations that make sense in that particular perspective. Okay, now, even though I talked about this as if explanations and explicability are two different phases, it turns out that they can be combined together. We have actually been working on this idea called expectation-aware planning, which takes both into account what the human expectations are and what the robot's goals are. And it also takes into account the robot's ontic actions, the actions that change the environment, and also communicative or explanatory actions, which essentially only change the human's mental model. And you can combine them. And this is a more complex planning process. In the old days, it's been called the epistemic planning. Typically, epistemic planning is actually quite costly. But in our scenario, for our kinds of scenarios, the two-level nesting, it turns out that we can compile this epistemic planning into single-agent planning. Okay, so in this particular case, if it is a purely explicable plan, then the explanatory actions would not be there at all. Otherwise, there would be a combination of explanatory actions as well as ontic actions. And as I said, it can be compiled down into a single agent planning scenario, which gives you efficiency. And although I looked at robots because they make better demos, it turns out this can also be, the same ideas can be used in the context of decision support systems, and we have actually done that too. One other thing is that we basically can also wait for the human to express a question before providing explanations, rather than directly providing explanations. And that is basically the idea of foil-based explanation. So you let the human ask a question, why not this other plan? And then the robot provides the explanation as to why the foil can be defeated. This particular foil-based explanation process can be sensitive to different levels of abstraction. And the very question that the human asks will allow the robot or the AI systems to localize where the human's model is. I want to also mention a little about the connection between this line of work and explainable AI in machine learning systems that some of you may have heard of. XAI has been hard, but mostly as a debugging tool for inscrutable representations by pointing parts of the model that, like, for example, this picture, this part is what makes me think it's a dog. This what makes me think it is a Alaskan Husky. And in fact, if you wind up pointing out a snow on the ground, then you realize that the system doesn't quite understand what the concept of Husky is. But pointing explanations are primitive. Explaining decisions will involve pointing over, explaining sequential decisions will involve pointing over space-time tubes. And in fact, civilization and symbolic reasoning emerged so that we can actually avoid doing that and exchange explanations in symbolic ways. Explanations are critical for collaboration, but they're not a soliloquy by the agent. And the kind of model reconciliation view we've been looking at fuse closely to psychological theories. Okay, and in fact, we also can show, in fact, some of the other work we have pointed out that keeping mental models of the humans and figuring out the kinds of classifications that they find, misclassifications they find particularly egregious versus misclassifications that are okay misclassifications, winds up improving the acceptance of machine learning systems. So not all failure modes are created equal. It's not just accuracy you should be counting. It is how egregious are your misclassifications. And you can do this as sort of connected to these mental modeling ideas. One thing that I want to mention is, how does AI agent get the human's model? Sometimes you can start with the same beginning model, and then these models will be drifting, and so you will then, you can reason about the drifts. Other times you have to actually learn the model from either the traces And we can also actually do this reasoning in a model-free way. For example, as I showed in the explicable planning, that distance between what the robot is doing and what the humans expect it to do, and the distance you want to minimize, instead of directly computing that distance from explicit models, I can compute this indirectly by learning a sort of a preference function, a labeling function from the humans, and using that labeling function in place of the explicit model. So this is a way in which you are actually using the model in a model-free way in this human AI interaction. It turns out that the same idea can be extended even when you have explanations involved, explanatory actions involved, because you can actually do the same sort of labeling computation, labeling function learning, except this time you would be doing your behavior as well as some explanatory messages thrown in, and then see whether how the labeling from the human changes. So in some sense, you are indirectly learning the semantics of the explanatory messages themselves. We can also look at differing vocabularies, and when there is vocabulary differences, basically the machine has to convert its explanation into concepts that humans can understand. And so when basically you will learn concept classifiers and convert the explanations in terms of these concepts, and there is some work that we are currently involved in on that too. And then finally, from the point of view of checking whether these kinds of ideas make sense, for humans, you do actually need to do careful, systematic human subject studies. And we have done that. We have actually collaborated, and I would suggest that anybody interested in Humanaware AI systems should be looking very seriously at careful human subject studies. And so we do that, and we, for example, have shown that the kind of model of reconciliation explanations and explicable behavior do help the support the interaction between the machines and the human and AI systems. There are a variety of extensions of what we have shown you. A few things that I'll mention is basically include allowing for customized explanations for multiple humans in the loop. In this particular case, there are multiple humans, and the system essentially will track the model separately and provide explanations to them separately. And so that's sort of context-specific explanations. We've also been looking at how to generalize these notions of interpretability from both our work as well as from other communities, including robotics community, and to talk about landscape of definitions for interpretable behavior, and also providing a Bayesian account of this whole interpretable behavior. Now, I've been talking about how to use these mental models in the context of supporting humans, but you can also, in a cooperative setting, you can also use the same ideas. Once you are tracking mental models, you can use that to deceive them too. So for example, in this particular demo, a robot in one case using the partial observability is making Anaga do something else so that she won't be able to see the action it is doing. And in the other case, she's asking her attention directly to look at what she's doing. So in this particular way, you can simultaneously signal to your friends and head fake enemies. This is also a direction that we will be able to use using the mental model. That leads us to almost my last part, which is that there are a bunch of ethical quandaries that this mental modeling of humans bring into play. Evolutionarily, mental modeling allowed us both to cooperate or compete. Lying becomes possible. If you go back to Salian test, lying becomes possible only because we can model others' mental states and realize they are different from ours. Human-aware AI systems with mental modeling capabilities bring many additional ethical quandaries, such as would we want AI systems, AI assistant tell us white lies, for example. And then also, when humans are working with systems that have social intelligence, they tend to fall much more harder for potential manipulation by those systems. So these are things that you need to worry about. As I said, head fakes are really the most powerful deep fakes, and we need to be worried about those kinds of social issues. We have actually shown that the model reconciliation framework can be used to capture both lies of omission and lies of commission. And we have done some work that we published in the AI Ethics and Society Conference on how, to what extent are people willing to be told white lies by AI systems as against other humans. You do realize that human society works on us telling each other some white lies. For example, if you ask me, how do you look? I know that I'm supposed to say you look good. Right? So there are some white lies we do. The question is, do you want AI systems to tell white lies to kind of induce right kind of behavior on people, on nudging and so on? So these are very interesting challenges that come in. In summary, effective human interaction requires, of course, AI systems to be able to manage human mental models. I showed you some of the technical aspects as well as the challenges about explicable behavior, explanation generation, and handling vocabulary differences. And then I told you that we need to actually have human subject studies carefully to check whether our theories make sense. And then mental modeling capabilities open up a new Pandora's box of ethical issues. You do need to mental model to effectively cooperate, but then that also allows for head fakes, and we need to think about how to manage them. There is a paper on some of these things in the most recent AI magazine as the cover article that you might be interested in looking at. And I want to end on this note. It looks as if getting computers to work with humans and be aware of AI systems, to be aware of humans, brings in a whole new slew of additional challenges. And you might wonder, why do I want to do that? Well, on the other hand, as you know, basically most of you want the AI systems to actually work within the society we have, rather than us humans going into the society of robots. And so it is a worthwhile thing for us to take human-aware AI systems and their challenges seriously. In the introduction to AI courses, people talk about intelligent agents, and an intelligent agent basically doesn't model much in the normal architecture. It doesn't model much the other human agents in the environment. And I think increasingly we need to consider intelligent agent architectures that will take both the human mental states, the effects of the agent's actions on the human mental states as well as the environment. And that's when we will have truly human-aware AI systems. I'm going to stop here with that summary slide, and I'll take any questions you might have. Thank you.